Immediately contesting the center, this pawn grab opens diagonals for bishops and prepares for rapid development. Establishing immediate central presence mirrors white's intent, setting the stage for a symmetrical pawn structure battle. Challenging the center immediately creates dynamic imbalances and fight for central squares. Solidifying the center with this pawn structure, black prepares to develop pieces and contest central space. Developing the knight quickly asserts central influence, aiming for a robust pawn structure while preparing for kingside expansion. Developing the knight to its most active square immediately contests white's central ambitions and prepares for pawn advances. Solidifying the center and preparing kingside castling with tempo, while maintaining flexibility for pawn breaks. Capturing the pawn immediately opens central files, a bold move that sacrifices central control for potential piece activity later. Recapturing the pawn with this setup clears the way for queen development and a solid pawn structure. Black immediately stakes a claim on the queen side, embracing pawn expansion to challenge white's central ambitions. Challenging black's pawn on b5 by pushing the pawn forward immediately creates significant spatial pressure on the queen side, forcing black to defend their advanced pawn or lose valuable territory. Gaining space on the queen side is a bold gambit, immediately challenging white's central control and potentially restricting his pieces. However, it also creates a potential weakness along the queenside diagonal and might prove a target for white's active pieces. Attempting to pry open the queenside, white repositions the knight to prepare potential advancement or rerouting, though it sacrifices immediate central influence and creates a slight outpost for black's knight on c5 if not immediately addressed. Solidifying the central pawn majority and preparing to develop the bishop, this move seeks to gradually improve black's position and resist white's attempts to seize space on the queenside. Securing that central pawn with the bishop, white reinforces their influence and prepares to contest the d5 square, potentially initiating a rapid development sequence. Initiating development with the bishop fortifies black's center and prepares for castling, a fundamental step in securing the king's safety and integrating pieces into the game's core action. Securing the monarch initiates a phase of development, preparing to actively contest the center and potentially launch an offensive on the kingside. Securing the monarch behind a pawn shield is a sensible defensive maneuver, consolidating black's position after a series of pawn advances and captures that have opened up the queenside structure. Solidifying the queenside pawn structure prevents black's typical queenside expansion and prepares to activate the queenside pieces, potentially eyeing the d5 square. Unleashing a potent central pawn thrust, black immediately challenges white's ambitious queenside expansion and seeks to dismantle the imposing pawn chain. This aggressive counterplay aims to seize initiative and open lines for active piece play. Unveiling the bishop from its protective pawn shield, white aims to activate this piece on the long diagonal, potentially pressuring black's queenside structure and preparing for future central expansion. A deliberate placing of the bishop, reinforcing its influence along the long diagonal, and preparing to connect the rooks while simultaneously blocking the advance of white's queenside pawn majority. A surprising retreat, the knight embarks on a journey that promises to be anything but direct, perhaps aiming to establish a more resilient defensive posture on the king's flank or reroute to a less occupied square, all while black solidifies their central pawn structure and eyes attacking chances on the queenside. Developing the knight to its most active square initiates a promising counterattack, aiming to dislodge white's centralized light-squared bishop and potentially open lines for its own pieces toward the kingside. Initiating a pawn capture on c5 immediately simplifies the position and loosens black's central grip, potentially opening the d-file for future pressure. Reorienting the knight to the edge, n5 aims to challenge the bishop on b2, potentially forcing it to retreat and loosening the queenside control white has diligently constructed. This maneuver subtly redirects attacking pressure, shifting focus from the central complications to a more peripheral skirmish for square dominance and piece activity, with the knight eyeing potential outposts or disruptions to white's pawn structure. a calculated risk to seize control of key central squares, forcing black to confront immediate tactical possibilities while aiming to exploit the slight awkwardness of white's knight repositioning. Reclaiming the pawn, black aims to rectify the structural imbalance created by white's aggressive pawn advances on the queen side, seeking to simplify the position and potentially activate the pinned knight. Reclaiming the pawn with the knight ignites a dynamic struggle for central control, directly challenging black's pawn structure and aiming to dismantle any comfortable development. Black reclaims material, resolving the immediate tension in the center and solidifying their queenside pawn structure, but crucially opens the diagonal for their light-squared bishop to activate towards white's kingside. Shifting the knight to d3 offers a much-needed pivot, aiming to redeploy it to a more central square like e5 or even f4 to support potential kingside advances or bolster the pawn chain. It's a quiet repositioning that prepares for future skirmishes, prioritizing flexibility over immediate confrontation, and seeks to escape the current bind on the queen side while keeping an eye on controlling the important e5 square. Immediately launching the queen into the heart of white's position aims to disrupt their setup and exploit the temporarily undeveloped king's side. Focusing the knight towards the center, nf4 immediately stakes a claim on the e6 square, a critical outpost that can disrupt black's harmonious development and potentially prepare a kingside assault. This repositioning aims to increase pressure on black's queen and bishops while keeping options open for further queenside expansion or a swift tactical sequence. It's a move that demonstrates initiative, seeking to unbalance the position and force black to react to white's active intentions. The knight now eyes several important squares, including d5 and g6, hinting at potential threats that black must carefully parry. Sensing the potential for a tactical skirmish, black brings the queen into the fray, aiming to exploit the loosely guarded diagonal and perhaps create threats against white's somewhat uncoordinated pieces. Unraveling the queenside pawn structure creates immediate tension around black's king. The doubled f-pawns offer no true shelter, and the bishop pair, while potent, now faces a less obstructed central square. A surprising recapture, this immediately alters the pawn structure and opens up a diagonal for the queen, but it also surrenders control of the crucial e5 square. Black must now carefully consider the long-term implications of this decision, as white's pieces are poised to exploit the newly created weaknesses around the king. The subsequent maneuvering will likely revolve around consolidating material and finding an avenue for counterplay. Opening the c-file with the rook immediately challenges black's central pawn structure and prepares to exert pressure along that important avenue. Bringing the rook into the heart of the action, black aims to immediately challenge white's control of the d-file and activate a piece that has been somewhat passive until now, preparing for potential exchanges that could alleviate the pressure black has been feeling. Unleashing a surprise attack, white's queen aims to exploit the delicate central balance and disrupt black's harmonious piece placement. Targeting the kingside, this queen sortie creates immediate complications, probing for weaknesses in black's defensive structure as the initiative shifts decisively. A bold maneuver, the queen's journey to h5 injects a sharp tactical element, potentially forcing concessions or setting up tactical traps for black. This aggressive queen deployment signals white's intent to seize the initiative and put black's king under direct pressure, demanding a precise and resourceful response. With queen on h5, white introduces a potent attacking force, seeking to exploit the open lines and create mating threats against the uncastled, effectively, black king. A strategic repositioning unfolds, aiming to activate the rook along the open c-file, a pivotal artery in this queenside struggle. Reinforcing the central file, the rook now exerts pressure along the now open d-file, aiming to disrupt black's coordination and potentially threaten deeper penetration if the d-pawn becomes vulnerable again. Opening a path for the king's protector while simultaneously addressing the immediate threat on the kingside, this maneuver aims to bolster defenses by preparing a retreat for the monarch and creating potential counterplay through the newly activated bishop. Initiating a decisive rook exchange, white aims to simplify the position and potentially exploit the exposed black king. This maneuver opens the d-file for further pressure, creating immediate imbalances as the queens are now isolated from their supporting pieces. The trade immediately alters the pawn structure and significantly influences the game's trajectory, pushing towards a more tactical or endgame scenario. Opening up the d-file with the exchange of queens signifies a decisive shift towards a more endgame-oriented struggle where piece activity and pawn structure will dictate the flow of battle. The queen repositions to eye the weak light squares on black's queen side, simultaneously creating a potential outpost for a knight if the opportunity arises and subtly restricting black's piece mobility. Initiating a retreat for the bishop from the discovered attack on the queen, this move simultaneously prepares for potential future maneuvering and solidifies the pawn structure, aiming to avoid further tactical complications stemming from white's queen pressure. Solidifying the kingside structure, this thoughtful maneuver aims to prevent any potential infiltration or tactical breakthroughs by black's pieces that might target the monarch, while also preparing for a more centralized pawn advance later on. A daring infiltration into the queen's territory, aiming to disrupt white's pawn structure and potentially create entry points for black's remaining pieces along the c-file. A calculated repositioning to menace the queen side, aiming to exploit potential weaknesses on that flank after black's rook activity has subsided. Initiating a strategic regrouping, this maneuver aims to bolster the central pawn chain and prepare for potential kingside expansion, creating a more resilient structure against white's active queen. Asserting dominion over the d-file, this relocation of the rook immediately challenges black's queen and hints at a potential queen trade that could simplify white's position. Finally challenging the central files, this move aims to activate the rook from its passive defensive post and create counterplay on the d-file, potentially eyeing the weakened squares around white's king. Liberating the a1, rook opens up new avenues, even if it means a temporary material imbalance in the form of an exchanged queen. Reclaiming the central pawn opens a diagonal for your bishop and re-establishes a dynamic pawn structure, hinting at future complications even in this seemingly quiet position. Steering the knight towards the center promises greater influence over the board's critical squares. Opening the path for the rook and preparing to contest the d-file, this move also subtly repositions the queen to a more active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses should white's pieces become disorganized after the pawn exchange. Re-establishing knights in the center aims to regain dynamic piece activity and potentially initiate a kingside attack, creating new avenues for pressure while challenging black's centralized queen. Initiating a regrouping maneuver, black's bishop relocates to an active diagonal, eyeing potential weaknesses around white's king while reinforcing the pawn structure. Reclaiming the central file with the queen offers a dynamic re-engagement, subtly hinting at future pawn pushes or even a potential exchange sacrifice to destabilize the opponent's pawn structure. Finally clearing the path for the queen to become active, exchanging off the powerful bishop that has been so influential in white's queenside control. Unlocking the open king's diagonal, the knight's repositioning to the center suddenly sharpens the positional battle, creating a potent threat against black's king by exploiting the weakened light squares and potentially opening lines for further attack. A bold recapture, sacrificing immediate queen activity for a more centralized piece and attempting to disrupt white's pawn structure. Unleashing a queen sacrifice to disrupt black's pawn structure and gain control of the open files, white initiates a decisive endgame transition. Opening up the diagonal for the bishop to potentially infiltrate on the kingside is an interesting idea, but it leaves your pawns on the queenside rather exposed to white's centralizing knight, potentially creating a weakness that's hard to defend once white's pieces are better coordinated. Unlocking the queen's diagonal potential, this maneuver aims to activate the queen for more dynamic play. Black's queen repositions defensively, seeking safer squares away from white's centralizing knight and the menacing diagonal that currently splits black's position. This retreat, while necessary for immediate safety, allows white further latitude to consolidate their pawn structure and potentially open more lines for their rooks. The question remains whether this defensive maneuvering will eventually lead to a solid queenside counterplay or simply cede too much initiative. securing the pawn chain and preparing to expand on the queen side, a subtle but purposeful maneuver to achieve greater piece activity and potential for pawn breakthroughs. Shifting the queen to its 7th rank opens up avenues for potential harassment of white's pawn structure, particularly the isolated d pawn if it ever becomes one, while also preparing to contest the b-file and perhaps support a future pawn push. This pawn push aggressively contests central space and aims to create a passed pawn on the queen side, potentially forcing black to defend passively for the remainder of the game. Probing the pawn chain with the rook's advance aims to disrupt white's queenside structure, potentially creating weaknesses on the light squares or opening lines for counterplay. Opening the queen's diagonal for a potential rook lift on the 5th rank is an ambitious maneuver that aims to exploit the exposed black king. Unveiling a surprising regrouping, this maneuver repositions the bishop to a far more active diagonal, aiming to disrupt white's queen and rook coordination while bolstering black's central presence. Shattering the queen's pawn defense by abandoning the center offers immediate pawn capture, but it exposes the white king to potentially dangerous penetration along the newly opened diagonal for the opponent's queen. Challenging the central pawn advance, this maneuver directly confronts white's initiative and seeks to liberate black's king from the open files, aiming to create a more solid defensive structure in the upcoming endgame. Unlocking the c-file and potentially opening lines towards black's king is the immediate aim as white resolves the pawn on d5. Reclaiming the pawn with the bishop reestablishes material balance, but critically, it prevents white from consolidating their advanced pawns and offers a potential outpost for the bishop on a more active square once the pawn structure clarifies. Opening up the queenside creates immediate queenside pawns on the 5th rank, eyeing advancement into black's territory and potentially creating a passed pawn. This pawn push injects a welcome dose of dynamism, aiming to pry open the kingside and activate the bishop diagonal that has been stifled for so long. It's a proactive attempt to break the current positional deadlock and create immediate threats, forcing white to consider the potential for aggressive counterplay.